the brain is constantly processing, all of our senses together. And when those senses don't line up, when there's any kind of discrepancy between our visual and our auditory input, the brain really doesn't like that. And I mean, ultimately, ads have actors who are acting, and at times their facial expressions or what they're doing might not sync up perfectly to what they're saying, because again, it's acting. But when there's not that second sense kind of as that check on that experience, and it really is just the script in an audio ad or in an audio environment, it feels much more realistic because you're not having that clash of processing between those two inputs.
Welcome to the Sound and Marketing Podcast.
Welcome back to part 2 of my interview with Arafel Buzan and Mike Schulte of Mindshares NeuroLab. Today, we jump into the conversation talking about memory versus emotional intensity, changing messaging based off of the audio environment, the speed in which different emotions affect us, and building trust in a brand's messaging with vocal intention. I would be curious to see a study of people processing podcasts through far-field speakers, like through smart speakers and things like that, where there is distraction around them, rather than having the headphones on. Because with the TV, there's obviously distractions when you're there because you're not plugged in. It would be interesting to see if the rate of memory and recall and connection were the same, or if the numbers were different.
Yeah, I would love to do a home assistant based study, especially because if you just start thinking of the activities done in conjuncture to listening, a lot of that is going to be kind of like repeated motor skills, like cooking, right? Mm-hmm. And when you start to have those associations, you're actually helping memory processing. It's why people fidget. It's why people do stuff like that when they're trying to learn information. So it's quite likely that there's a different kind of way in for attentional and memory advantage when folks are doing something like a motor skill while they are listening. And I think that would be a fantastic study to explore.
Let's talk about memory versus intensity, because your study showed that the pre-roll ads had the higher memory recognition, but mid-roll has higher emotional intensity. How should people use this information when crafting their campaigns? Which is more important to the brain, would you think?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it really gets at the heart of the fact that podcast advertisements and audio advertisements in general allow for so much intentional strategy, linking up the purpose of an ad with the exact environment neurologically that's going to speak to what that purpose needs. So, for example, if we're a brand that's running a brand building campaign and it's quite emotional, and we really want people to associate our brand more with, trust and safety. That's going to be a fantastic use case of a mid-roll advertisement. You're really going to be picking up on kind of that host halo effect, how much people emotionally engage with, the hosts of the shows and with the content itself. And that's going to transfer over nicely to that mid-roll advertisement. But on the other hand, if you are running a campaign that is much more about, facts and figures, or a new launch, really something that is new information where you're going to need that attentional advantage, that memory encoding advantage, that's going to be a really good use case for a pre-ad. So all of that is kind of an interesting way to start thinking of how audio can serve many different purposes. I think for a long time, folks were a little wary of the audio space, thinking, what is the purpose of this medium exactly, and how should I think about it for my brand? I can't, maybe track it how I would track other campaigns. And that's not true anymore. There are so many ways to track and monitor the effectiveness of audio. And I think studies like this just help us understand how to personalize that experience so much more based off of the role of the campaign that a brand is running.
And I know that this wasn't part of the study, but I'm wondering, I don't know if you guys have done any of this research, but advertising, I know it's not mid-roll and pre-roll, but have there been studies documenting TV and like where the emotional and the memory hits for an ad on television? Because where I'm kind of going with this is I'm guessing it's different. And so I feel like with a podcast advertisement, I would imagine you guys would promote that you might want to retailer your advertisement, not just use the same thing for TV as you would for podcasting. Any thoughts on that?
We encourage kind of media environment endemic solutions when it comes to advertising. So not taking the same message and blasting it across. We definitely see the most success from a audio ad creative testing perspective, which we do a lot of in the NeuroLab. When we found that, that unit was made especially for the audio environment, and even more so when it's made especially for a specific purpose that the audio environment is really successful in. So when it's leaning into safety and trust messaging, when it's leaning into more kind of emotion-based messaging, for example, we found that love kind of ads and love stories do really well in the audio space. So when there is that kind of intention behind thinking of the platform, we definitely see increase in long-term memory encoding, increase in emotional engagement, and also increase in subconscious associations with the brand itself. We measure that pre and post exposure. And we find that these ads are really successful at fundamentally changing how people think about a brand at a subconscious level. So absolutely, when they are intentionally crafted for the environment and are acknowledging the strengths of the environment, that's when we're going to see the most success.
Keeping in mind the environment of the situation, the platform, the environment, everything. I feel like marketing and advertising in 30 years ago was very much more just kind of throw and see what takes, I find it really fascinating that we have so many different ways now to document and inform ourselves of how a consumer processes things. Like just going into, the NeuroLab itself is just fascinating to me.
Yeah, we absolutely think that it's a new way of looking at effectiveness, and has also kind of come right at the summit of everyone being obsessed with performance-based marketing and being able to track everything. And I think the NeuroLab kind of offers this nice step back from that to say, yes, we can track view rates and all of these metrics, but at a fundamental level, how are consumers thinking about and processing our brand? What are the emotions that they're associating with it? And how can we think about places in media where we can engage with them in truly meaningful ways through emotion and memory? So I think it's a very new way of looking at the industry at large, but there's something about it that just feels undeniably simplistic at the same time. And I think that's kind of the beauty of neuroscience is while it may seem a little odd to be using it to investigate media, we're really just in the business of talking to people at the end of the day. And a lot of that has to do with things like emotional connection and drivers. So really excited to be able to keep doing this research. And I think we've been learning a lot just about the human experience in general. We make the joke all the time in the NeuroLab now when we're listening to audio and we're having these like really strong emotional reactions. We're like, oh, it's just that information processing going on again. Like it's just, so it's been a fun way to look at the industry.
You're both passionate about your work. Is there anything coming up that coming down the way or that you're working on in the NeuroLab that's really exciting that you can tell us about?
I think that more and more we've had clients be really excited about the role that very intentional emotions can play, and the fact that their brand should kind of occupy a couple of key emotions at the core of their ethos. And so we've been working on a work stream with a couple of our clients called Planning for Emotion, where we take a really big step back from, the campaign level way of looking at things and say, as a brand, what are our key emotions? And then investigating different places in media where these emotions are most effectively communicated. And I think related to that, we've been doing a lot of academic work just around emotion in general. So what emotion best primes another emotion, which can sound a little funny, but when thinking of emotional territories in media, we don't want to just be surrounding the exact same emotion. We also want to be finding places where people are going to be in need of that emotional experience and really encode it in a powerful way. So we did a very interesting study all around priming joy. It was with a CPG company that we work with. And they wanted to be kind of this beacon of joy. So we looked at 3 environments. We looked at joy, priming joy. We looked at sadness, priming joy. And then we looked at fear, priming joy. And we looked at, the exact same ad for that brand in each of those environments. And for joy, we used stimuli of, babies laughing and golden retriever puppies running around, and then showed them an ad from the brand. For sadness, we made folks quite sad. We had them watch the intro to Up, which is like saddest 5 minutes of cinematic content, and then showed them the same ad, another group. And then the third cohort came in, and we scared them. We had them watch horror movie clips, and then we showed them the same ad. We then measured the relative ability for, that exact same ad to provoke joy in the brain. So out of those 3, out of joy priming joy, sadness priming joy, and fear priming joy, what do you think was most effective?
Oh gosh. I don't know, because I could see a lot of different outcomes from all of them.
Most people usually say sadness, and I think they're primed for the emotion priming question because we're doing emotion priming. So they're like, oh, it should be an opposite emotion. And that's quite true. When you start someone low in valence and give something really high in valence, that's what humans love, right? We love those emotion changes.
The roller coasters.
The roller coasters, exactly. But the issue with sadness is it's this incredibly slow emotion. We, sit in our sadness, we think about our sadness, and a 30-second ad from a CPG brand wasn't able to kind of overcome that hurdle. We saw that they eventually did, around 15 seconds, got out of that more negative valenced neurostate, but it wasn't enough to get to that really bright joy experience by the end. But we found something really interesting with fear. Fear is this incredibly fast emotion. We are very used to being scared and then laughing it off right afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, it started people quite negative in valence, but people overcame it in like less than a second. It was this incredible jump up into a really high joy state. And there's a lot of things you can do from a media perspective for that. You can buy different environments where, fear, like horror movies and partnerships with different places in the horror movie space, or even heavying up around Halloween and other times. So there's a lot of, I think, rich thinking in the planning for emotion space. And I think podcasts and audio play a huge role in that, because I'd say a lot of brands are very interested in the emotions that, the podcast environment can prime really successfully.
I'm just thinking of, nostalgia, the old radio shows where they would have their sponsors. Sometimes they were part of the program, and you see that a little bit now, but not a ton. And I'm wondering if we'll get past this pre and mid and post roll thing, and it'll be a true partnership between, this is more for like the narrative podcasts, but a real partnership between brand and product, podcast product. It might be a really interesting thing.
Yeah, and I think it would be very interesting, but also very successful for
I think
brands.
so too.
Yeah.
Yes, I do. My husband and I were audio video production company, and he's been preaching product, not just product placement in movies and film, but like product integration. So it's part of the story, and it hasn't caught on like we thought it would have by now.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because it's a very clear thing that we've seen in neural data that if, there's a can of soda behind someone in a shot, it, encodes at X%. But then if someone's physically touching it and consuming it and putting it back down and saying like, oh, I really needed that, I was so thirsty, or somehow connecting to it, we see a much higher engagement. And I kind of assume that was just like a tried and true insight and implication at this point, that like if you're authentically integrating a product or environment, people are going to more effectively encode and remember that experience.
Well, and not even just that, but think of Wayne's World. Remember at the end with the Pepsi and the pizza and the Tylenol, I think it was. Like, it was totally funny, but like I remember that and it was hilarious. And I don't know. I wonder what their sales did right after Wayne's World came out, because that was pretty popular.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. I mean, we like the simplest things, like we tested because everyone shows apps in ads now. And we've kind of A/B tested how if you just show the app, it has one response. But then if you have hands that are physically like using and touching the app, it has this huge up in emotion and memory. And Mike has some interesting findings too about even like being able to see someone using the phone like over their shoulder. People really like that. It's kind of like including them in the narrative. It's very versus if you're not able to see the screen.
And I think some of that in some way comes back to trust, because I feel like, in some contexts we are questioning the legitimacy of the actor, in the case of a TV ad, in terms of like their interest or whether or not they're actually interacting with the app that's being advertised. So I think if you can actually, see the screen or see someone actually interacting with the app, it sort of resolves that tension that we have and causes people to lean in a little bit more.
Very interesting.
And that's so interesting, because it kind of gets at like one of the biggest points of audio and why it might be so emotionally engaging is the brain is constantly processing, all of our senses together. And when those senses don't line up, when there's any kind of discrepancy between our visual and our auditory input, the brain really doesn't like that. And I mean, ultimately, ads have actors who are acting, and at times their facial expressions or what they're doing might not sync up perfectly to what they're saying, because again, it's acting. But when there's not that second sense kind of as that check on that experience, and it really is just the script in an audio ad or in an audio environment, it feels much more realistic, because you're not having that clash of processing between those two inputs.
Right. And I think just overall, there's less room for error in a podcast advertisement because of that.
That goes back to, like watching a video as opposed to reading a book. If your mind has perceived the story one way and then the visual tells you a different one, that would confuse your brain, because you've already kind of made up your mind about it. So, well, thank you guys so much for being with me today. If anyone wanted to get a hold of you, is there any way that someone could contact you?
Yeah, so you can contact either of us at our first and last name. So first.last at mindshareworld.com. And we're always happy to talk to folks about the neuroscience of sound and audio.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much again for your time, both of you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Arafel and Mike of Mindshares NeuroLab for joining us. I highly recommend checking out the website. I'll link to it in the show notes. And don't forget to check out my new course, Sounds, Power, and Influence in Marketing, which has officially launched. I love how it turned out, and I can't wait for you to check it out. So go on over to soundandmarketing.com to watch the trailer, view the curriculum, and sign up today. Years of research and information has made this course possible, and I'm confident that there is a little something or a lot in there for everyone. If you're still not sure, don't hesitate to reach out. I'd be happy to answer any and all questions you might have. For inquiries on sonic branding development or consultations, you can find me at Dreamr Productions. That's DREAMR Productions.com, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. You can also email me at Jeanna, JEANNA, at dreamrproductions.com. For more of the Sound and Marketing podcast, don't forget to follow, subscribe, and share. You can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, iHeartRadio, Pandora, and Stitcher. All links will be provided in the show notes. This episode was produced by Dreamr Productions and hosted, written, and edited by me, Jeanna Isham. Let's make this world of sound more intriguing, more unique, and more on brand.